Hey everyone, it's P, and today I want to start with a question. Do you really need expensive tools to build something amazing? I know a lot of you, just like me, get tempted by those high-end woodworking tools you see everywhere. But let's be honest, those prices can get out of hand really fast. Before you know it, you've spent a fortune and you haven't even made your first cut yet. So, here's my challenge. I set out to build 5 genius woodworking projects using nothing but cheap, budget-friendly tools. No fancy machines, no top-shelf brands, just the basics you can pick up at any hardware store or even borrow from a friend. I wanted to see if you could really pull off impressive woodworking without breaking the bank. Let me tell you, some of these turned out way better than I expected, and I'll be real, one of them almost didn't make it. But the biggest surprise comes at the end with Project 5. So make sure you stick around for that reveal. All right, enough talk. Let's start with the first build. For this first project, I wanted to make a clean, modern floating shelf. And to really push the limits, I decided to use a no-frills circular saw, the kind you find in the bargain bin. Now right away, I ran into the challenge of getting a perfectly straight cut. With expensive saws, you might have a built-in guide, but with this one, it was all about improvising. I grabbed a simple straight edge, clamped it down, and used it as my guide. The first cut was a little rough, but with slow, steady pressure and a sharp blade, I got through it. Accuracy is everything with a floating shelf, so to clean up the edges, I broke out my budget sander. It's not the fastest tool, but with a little patience, I was able to smooth everything down. You really learn to appreciate the process, slowing down, checking your work, and feeling the wood as you go. After sanding, the pieces were ready to be assembled. For assembly, I used wood glue and a couple of basic clamps. No fancy joinery, just a strong glue up and making sure everything stayed square. I double-checked with a carpenter's square, made a few minor tweaks, and left it to dry overnight. The next morning, the joints were rock solid. The final step was mounting hardware. I used some simple L brackets from the hardware store, hidden behind the shelf. The end result? A floating shelf that looks just as good as anything you'd buy at a big box store. Maybe even better because you built it yourself. What I love about this project is how it proves you don't need expensive equipment to get a clean, modern look. With careful measuring, a steady hand, and a little bit of patience, you can absolutely pull this off with budget tools. Next up, I wanted to tackle something that demands a little more precision, a wooden phone stand. This is where cheap tools really get put to the test, because getting that perfect angled slot for your phone isn't easy when your tools aren't exactly dialed in. I started by measuring out my cuts on a scrap piece of hardwood. To cut the angled slot, I had to get creative. No fancy miter saw here, just that same old circular saw, set carefully to the angle I needed. I took it slow, double-checked my lines, and used a clamp to hold everything steady. The blade wandered a bit, but by creeping up on the cut and taking off just a little at a time, I was able to get a slot that fit my phone perfectly. Sanding was especially important on this project. With cheap tools, the cuts can be a little rough, so I spent extra time smoothing out every surface and rounding over the edges. I even used a sanding block to get into the tight spots and give it that finished look. Assembly was straightforward. I glued the 2 main pieces together and used a clamp to keep everything in place while it dried. The real challenge was making sure the angle was correct so the phone wouldn't tip over. I checked it with my phone before the glue set and made a quick adjustment. In the end, the phone stand was rock solid and looked great on my desk. And honestly, this project really proved that skill and patience matter way more than the price of your tools. If you take your time and pay attention to the details, you'll end up with something you're proud to use every day. So, if you've ever hesitated to start a woodworking project because you thought your tools weren't good enough, try something like this. It's all about technique and practice. For project number 3, I wanted to make something practical, a sturdy storage box. This meant cutting multiple panels that needed to fit together just right. With cheap tools, you have to be ready to make a lot of little adjustments because your cuts aren't always perfect straight off the saw. I measured and marked out all my panels, sides, bottom, and lid. Cutting them out with the bargain circular saw was a challenge. The edges weren't all perfectly square, So I took my time, used my straight edge guide, and checked each piece after every cut. Some panels needed a little extra sanding to get them to fit together nicely. Assembly was all about patience. I used wood glue on the joints and basic clamps to hold things in place. Because the cuts weren't perfect, I had to do a bit of persuading, tapping panels together and filling tiny gaps with wood filler. It's not glamorous, but it works. After the glue dried, I sanded the whole box to even out any imperfections. I focused on the corners, making sure everything felt smooth to the touch. A quick pass with a budget finish gave it a nice, clean look and helped hide some of the little flaws. The final storage box turned out sturdy and totally usable. It's not perfect, but it's strong, and it does the job. This project really showed me that you don't need flawless tools to build something useful, just a willingness to adapt and a little extra elbow grease. If you're building with budget tools, expect to spend more time on the fit and finish. But when you put in that extra effort, you end up with something that's yours, built by hand and ready to use. Now, let's get into something a bit bigger. Building a mini coffee table. This is where the difference between cheap and expensive tools really becomes obvious. Every cut has to be accurate, especially for the tabletop and legs, or you'll end up with a wobbly result. First, I cut the tabletop and legs from a sheet of plywood. The budget circular saw did the job, but I had to go slow and double-check every measurement. I used a basic square to keep the legs at the right angle, marking everything twice just to be sure. The saw blade left some rough edges, so I spent extra time sanding everything down and making sure all the pieces fit together snugly. I attached the legs using simple joinery, wood glue and screws. With cheap tools, it's important to pre-drill holes to avoid splitting the wood, so I took my time with that step. I double-checked everything for level before tightening the screws. The assembly process took longer than it would with fancy jigs or power tools, but the result was worth it. After assembly, I filled any small gaps with wood filler and sanded again to get a smooth finish. I wiped it down and put on a couple coats of clear finish to bring out the grain and protect the surface. It's always surprising to see how much a bit of sanding and finish can transform a build, even if you started out with budget materials and tools. The final mini coffee table turned out solid and looks great. It's proof that you don't need a shop full of expensive gear to build real furniture. You just need to be willing to put in a little extra time to get things right. This project gave me a lot of confidence in my cheap tools. If you're watching this and wondering if you can build something like this at home, the answer is absolutely yes. Just measure twice, cut slow, and don't be afraid to make adjustments as you go. For the final project, and the biggest surprise, I tackled a piece of modern wall decor. This was definitely the hardest build, because it required a ton of consistent repeated cuts for the geometric pattern. With expensive tools, you'd use a miter saw with stops, but I had to rely on my trusty cheap circular saw and a lot of patience. I started by measuring and marking every single cut, double-checking as I went. The first few pieces didn't line up perfectly, and I realized I needed to slow down even more. I made a simple jig out of scrap wood to help keep my angles consistent, and that made a huge difference. Still, some of the cuts were off, so I had to sand and adjust each piece to get them to fit together. Assembly was a challenge. I laid out the design on a flat surface, dry fitting all the pieces before gluing anything down. Some parts needed to be trimmed, others needed extra sanding. It was a real test of patience, but I stuck with it, checking the alignment after every step. When it came time to glue everything down, I worked in small sections to keep things manageable. I used a lot of clamps and even some painter's tape to hold tricky angles in place while the glue dried. Some pieces wanted to shift out of alignment, but I kept adjusting until everything looked just right. The final reveal blew me away. The wall decor turned out stylish and modern. Honestly, it looks like something you'd see in a high-end gallery. This was the project I thought might fail, but with patience and creative problem solving, it became the highlight of the whole challenge. If you're ever doubting what you can do with cheap tools, take on a project like this. It'll stretch your skills, but the results might surprise you as much as they did me. So, there you have it. 5 genius woodworking projects, all built with nothing but cheap tools. If there's one thing I learned from this challenge, it's that budget tools can absolutely get the job done. You just need more patience, a steady hand, and a bit of creativity to make up for the lack of high-end features. Sure, expensive tools make things faster and easier, but they aren't required to get started. Anyone can make something amazing, no matter what's in their toolbox. What counts is your willingness to learn, adapt, and put in the work. Every mistake is a lesson, and every finished project is proof of what you can do. Now, I'd love to know, would you rather start woodworking with cheap tools or save up for the expensive ones? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're curious about how cheap tools stack up against the fancy stuff, check out the next video where I put them head to head.